Chris Chan for KaijuPop.com and happy old year as we take a look back to this month in gaming history. It's January 1995 and that means it's winter CES. The big news from Consumer Electronics Show, or the big showings, were indeed from Sony and Sega for the PlayStation and the Saturn, but we've covered those in enough detail in prior months. In both systems' native Japan, it was a quiet month in January. The software libraries for both systems gradually gathering up pachinko and sports simulators. But the news at CES was really around, the speculation at CES was really around when these machines would make it to the West. Sony were being coy and quiet about release date and price of the Sony PlayStation in the West, while Sega were earmarking an autumn release, but that was definitely going to change a few months down the line. So what else was on display at CES? Well, it was a month and a year of virtual reality. Does that sound familiar? Well, if virtual reality today is close to making an appearance at the home, if you listen to Sony or if you listen to Oculus, there were a lot more kinks to be ironed out in 1995 when it came to making consumer-grade VR. Atari were showing off a virtual reality system that was going to be connected to their already failing, if not failed completely, Jaguar system. This was being showed off alongside a demo of Missile Command called Missile Command 3D. And, well, yeah, it didn't exactly look top of the line. And, of course, the Atari Jaguar VR would never make it out, seeing as the Jaguar itself was circling the drain, and Atari as a corporation was about to get swallowed up anyway. In the red corner, meanwhile, was Nintendo with the Virtual Boy. Gunpei Yokoi's pet project had already been in the works for a long time, and he wanted to work significantly further on it, perhaps to wait for the falling price of LEDs to allow for more colours than simply red to be displayed and beamed directly into the user's eyes. Still, Nintendo at this point had spent far too much R&D money on this system, and had issued Yokoi an ultimatum: get this thing out by the summer or it doesn't come out at all. Come out by the summer it did, and we'll go further into its problems later on this year. Speaking of troubled Nintendo projects, Star Fox 2 was playable on the 95 CES show floor in nearly complete form. This was all set to go out, and Argonaut had pretty much finished it, if you listen to the online arguments. But Nintendo, being wholly invested and dedicated to the Nintendo 64 at this point, which was still set for a release in 1995 at this point, decided to pull the game completely. So Star Fox 2 never saw the light of day, despite some promise at CES. The closest we got was the Star Fox Command game that would later come out on DS, and that sort of gave hints of this more free-flowing 3D shooter with some tactical elements. So what of the games that did come out in January 1995? Well, as I mentioned, the Saturn and the PlayStation didn't exactly have thrilling software libraries this month anyway, after a busy launch. It was kind of in a wind-down phase before 1995 really kicked in earnest. So, surprisingly enough, the biggest quote-unquote next-gen releases were on 32X this month, a pair of them. Afterburner Complete made its way to the 32X, and much like Space Harrier 2, it was an arcade-perfect conversion, pretty much. Fast and with all the scaling effects you would expect. It's just that really at this point we would expect arcade perfection from a 1980s arcade game on a home format, but still, it was a pretty good thing to plump for, with a few extras thrown in for the home version too. There was also Cosmic Carnage making its way to the system, a fighting game with liberal use of scaling effects for close-up animations of throws and special moves. This also had kind of an interesting thing where you were swapping around different armor for different body parts of your fighter. It was actually quite involved in a way. It's just that, well, the characters were pretty awful, and the game was very quickly forgotten, partly because it was on the 32X as well. But still, hey, you could do much worse, especially if you had a 32X. You didn't really have many other options at this stage. There were a couple of DOS and Amiga releases this month. All New World of Lemmings was the third mainline installment in the Lemmings series from DMA Design. The team that would later on become Rockstar was in a difficult third album phase here, after Lemmings was obviously very, very well remembered, and Lemmings 2, the kind of forgotten sequel, was even better. Lemmings 3, well, no. It took a very different approach, kind of assumed that people in these days of wanting flashy graphics would want their Lemmings to be rather larger and easier to pick out on screen. It really pared down the number of tribes and abilities from a staggeringly huge number in Lemmings 2, the tribes, back down to a very scaled back 3 here. And even scale back the number of abilities that you could use on a particular stage, instead making those abilities more intricate. You would pick up items and drop them. You could use your diggers to dig in any direction. The game's sort of pausing for a second while you can choose a direction for your guy to aim his ability. And it all just kind of became a little bit too micromanagey for many people's tastes, especially when rampaging monsters were adding to the mix, which was a terrible, terrible idea. It was a real profound disappointment and was soon, very, very quickly, in fact, forgotten as DMA Design were hard at work for Lemmings 3D on PC and PlayStation later on in 1995. Also making an appearance on computers was Dreamweb this month. This top-down psychological horror game would kind of gain a little bit of a cult audience later on, mainly because of the idea behind it. It was pretty cool. You were this guy plagued by dreams of some spiritual monks guiding him to eradicate evil in the world. And of course, spoiler alert, the guy was mental and just killing innocents here. So it was kind of an interesting murder simulator, almost along the lines of Hotline Miami much later on. The problem was this was also the very, very worst kind of point-and-click adventure. Pixel hunting is a problem that many people complain about with classic adventure games, and it was a massive, massive issue in Dreamweb, where very often you were looking for items that were literally a couple of pixels wide to pick up, and you had to pick up everything because the game was really, really terrible at teaching you what items you would need next. In fact, the graphics were so tiny and indistinguishable, you had a special zoomed-in view in the bottom left corner of the screen that would show you in fuller detail what exactly you were looking at. Still, it didn't make it easy to play, and the inventory system was so poor, and very often reactions required were so fast that you would die through no real fault of your own. And it was just full of horrible adventure stuff. You walk up to a door, but you can't go out the door without using the door. If you try and use some doors, you're told that you can't use some doors because you have to push the keypad to the right of the door that you can't see. It's just very, very stodgy and awful, despite the fact that it had a few decent ideas. Dreamweb coming out in January 1995. And finally, the humble Amiga was ticking on with Shadow Fighter, which came out on sort of technologically advanced AGA machines in January of 95. It was always really, really difficult to get fighting games to work on the humble Amiga, mainly because most players only had a single button joystick to work with. So that's why Shadow Fighter earned a lot of plaudits. It was actually incredibly playable, all the more so if you had a joypad plugged in and you could perform the special moves with ease. But with a mix of context sensitivity with holds and directions and button pushes, this was actually entirely playable, a fighting game. And a fairly deep fighting game on a single button joystick. Of course, it would, being as how it was on the market of the Amiga and nowhere else, it was very, very quickly forgotten about by the world at large. But this was definitely the Amiga's best fighting game and would remain so until the system faded into further obscurity. That was January 1995 in a nutshell. For more on gaming history in January 1985, 95, and 2005, check out the full This Month in Gaming History feature on kaijupop.com.